Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to the third session in our science communication series. The previous two workshops we've had in this series, which have been on effective writing strategies and policymaking reports, we've largely dealt with science communication in the written format, so how words are used to convey information, context, and meaning. On behalf of the Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group today, I'm very happy to welcome data journalist Amanda Cox to talk to us about the visual side of communication, so how compelling graphics are designed and used to present data to a wide audience, from newsreaders to policymakers and politicians. And perhaps the only introduction I need to give for Ms. Cox is that her Wikipedia profile actually references a quote that she's known as the Michael Phelps of infographics. And indeed, she has received numerous accolades and awards in data visualization, infographics, and statistical reporting. And she's widely regarded as a leader in the field of data journalism. Currently, Ms. Cox is the head of special data projects at USA Facts. USA Facts is a nonprofit organization which makes government data accessible and understandable to the American public. And prior to joining USA Facts in January of this year, she spent 16 years as a graphics editor at the New York Times. And from 2016, she was editor of their dedicated data journalism section, The Upshot. She earned her bachelor's degree in economics from St. Olaf College in Minnesota and a master's degree in statistics from the University of Washington. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today, Ms. Cox, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, Stephen, thanks for having me. Like Stephen said, I spent almost all of my adult career at the New York Times. I just left last month, but it remains, the only work I have to talk about. So we'll still talk about a bunch of New York Times work today and work from other people as well. And so when I give these sort of talks, I say that there's really like three things that we're trying to do with graphics, usually over and over and over again, at least in the context of the newsroom. And the first of those things is just scale, like how big is stuff? It's pretty easy. You can understand it well. Here's an example by an artist named Evan Roth that, you can do it on an airplane where he took his SkyMall catalog and he started ripping out faces of it and, separate the white people from the non-white people. And so the idea here is that precision doesn't really matter. It's just big versus not big. And that I think is true often, even in work where you might argue precision matters a little bit more. Here's a piece we did earlier, or, I guess it was last summer now, but, here was President Biden, what he originally proposed to do to the budget. And then if the infrastructure plan is all that passes, that's the kind of size of it. I think of this as a sort of scale graphic in that, millions and billions and trillions are words that I think we don't find so intuitive, right? Like, Congress passed a $7 million, you could often, swap it with a lot bill today. And, there are corrections of those sort of things that go on in newspaper land. And I think those corrections always hurt because it's like, saying you got a million or a billion or a trillion, you mix it up with a different one is saying like, I mixed up a golf ball with a watermelon with a hot air balloon, right? Like that's an embarrassing thing to do. Like I didn't know whether I was looking at a watermelon or a hot air balloon. But I think the power of graphics is you can get the sense of scale, just how big is stuff without really having to think about it too much. Same different example. For $250 in the United States, you could buy one inhaler. France, you could buy 7. Different type of thing. 2 inhalers. 37 in Greece. Just let this play for a couple more seconds. Different type of medicine. And then this is the one I've been waiting for. United States, for $250, you can get 51 of this sort of pill. Saudi Arabia, almost 10,000. That's the idea that, like, that is not a hard idea. Those are just two numbers. They're not hard, but I think seeing it, you feel it in a different way than if I just told you those numbers in a sentence. Like actually seeing it, you feel it. So scale is the first of the type of three. Scale is the first of the type three things that I think we're doing over and over and over again. The second one of those things is, a little bit harder than scale, is putting things in context. So my favorite context example is not one of ours either. This is a NASA diagram of the moon. It's a nice diagram. There's a nice legend, all kinds of things. The scale is in meters and feet. So whether you're an American or not, you're good to go. And you could study this and you could figure it out. Also a NASA graphic, same diagram. They take it and they stick it on a baseball field. So now if you're familiar with baseball at all, like you will never have to think about how big was the walk on the moon, right? Like I connect it to knowledge that you already have without really having to think about it too much. And still it's the same information. You could still see where the TV cameras are and things like that. So the Times has done that too, doing things like, here's what a luge track would look like if you put it in Times Square. And it's fun, right? Like you even if you've been watching the Olympics, like you could start to think about it. You start to think about like size and shape and context in a different way because it's connecting to knowledge that you already know. And so in some ways, you can say like, this is nice, but my own research is about abstract things. It's not about the size of luge tracks. If it were about the size of luge tracks, I get it. It's easy. Like I can connect it to some physical thing about some windows. But I think the same trick about like, can I put it in context? Can I put it closer to things that also works for the ideas that are more abstract. So, here's an example, more than a decade ago now, but it's just about kind of the unemployment rate. And usually we would draw one line, and here in this case we said, let's actually like draw a bunch of different lines. So here's, men versus women, or we can intersect these things. So here's a certain type of people. If I try too hard, that I can find the outliers. Here's the effective education. I think these buttons, the four-way interactions, are in some ways like poor man's regression, right? Like what does it do if I change, now just change race, or holding constant that you have a college degree. And so sometimes when I talk about this graphic, I say like, a lot of good songs have background singers. And I think that's what the gray lines are doing here. They're acting as background singers, right? Like they're not there to call attention to themselves, but they're there to provide context that you can define a group for whom the unemployment rate is 3% or almost 50% without having to like make that group too weird, right? Like they're there to make the main guy look good. If you think of the main guy as the overall average, but also connect it closer to maybe your own group of friends or your own life experience. And so we do that like, one context lines over and over and over again. If you like policy, here's, an example of a sports policy that changed this year where like Major League Baseball was like, no, we're really actually serious about not putting sticky stuff on your hands. And you can see like, something changed in 2021. The context of, the gray lines in this case being actually blue, but baseballs were spinning faster after something happened in 2021, or we've done it with, Medicare policy too. So here's how much Medicare is projected to cost. In a variety of different periods. And so even if we're getting harder here, even if you don't know things about Medicare policy, you can see like something has changed in these projections, right? Like if I just gave you one line and you didn't know a lot, I think it wouldn't be that interesting of a line. It would either be, oh, spending always goes up on Medicare, or oh, spending is already always flat on Medicare. But if I give you them together, even if I come in with very little knowledge and know something, it becomes a more interesting thing. It becomes a puzzle. It becomes something that like, oh, it's interesting that we can't project this very accurately, or we haven't over the last decade. I don't want you to think, though, that the key to good data visualization is a bunch of gray lines in the back of your graphic, which is sort of the lesson of the last three examples about context. So here's a couple where the context is different. This was an example from a time when Damien Hirst, who's maybe the world's most commercially successful artist, was releasing a catalog of his spot paintings, which are like the painting behind him. Which up until that point, it wasn't exactly clear how many of them there were. Which if you're selling paintings that are sort of circles in a grid, it might be good if the world doesn't know how many of them that there are. And so, we have data from ArtNet about like how much do various artists, how much does their work cost? And so in some ways you could think of this is a classic data viz context example. I know my story is about Damien Hirst, so maybe I'll make his line dark. And then the context is like, here are some other artists in the world who've been successful, or an average sort of index for different types of artists who are maybe similar, right? But Damien Hirst is an artist who, like, he puts sharks in formaldehyde. And so it's like, do you really respect Damien Hirst's work with a bunch of gray lines in the background? And I think the answer to that is no. So we start, can we actually see the work? Can we get closer to the level of what this thing is about? And so here is an example of, we'll just pull the spot paintings and we'll track how much they cost over time, right? So if you bought a bunch of circles in a grid for, $3.5 million by, the mid 2010s, you were probably underwater on them, right? Like that was probably not the peak of the market is the shape of these things. But then in this, we couldn't get permission to use the images, right? We couldn't get image rights for this kind of approach. And so that's fine. We'll just trace them, right? Like they're just circles in a grid. That's not that hard, and actually published a graphic which looks closer to this. And I like the idea that we could trace them in part because it takes advantage of what was unique about this data. The unique thing about Damien Hirst spot paintings is that like they're not complicated, right? Like you could trace them with a computer, like you could teach your computer like how to recognize the circles, and it's not hard. And then you can see like, the context of the little guy inside, or the little manta, you can get a sense of like, how big is this painting without really having to actually think about it a little bit. Or the like guitar and the skateboard, the cheap ones do that for you too. And so same idea still, right? If you bought it for $3.5 million, you're probably underwater. But you get the sense of what these things are, how many of them are, without really having to think about it. Here's a different example of that, a more sciencey example. My colleague Jonathan Coram was working on a story about, people had discovered some new information about how whales feed. So he's looking at the academic, or a certain type of whale, not all whales, but whatever this type of whale is. And is looking at the academic paper. There's a bunch of charts in it. They look something like this. There's more charts. They look something like this. Jonathan was attracted to this one. He's like, oh, I kind of get immediately, intuitively what is going on there. I see that. And you could make that a little bit more designy too, right? Like you could take that exact chart. You could put some labels on it directly about like, here's a certain type of phase. Here's what's going on. You do the same kind of little scale trick that we put with the man on next to the painting. So you get a sense of like how big these feet are and how big the whale is without thinking about it. But there's something in that chart that got cut off. And if you're a scientist, like you don't need it. It's just blank space essentially, but it's the like, how deep was it where that was going? And that's, if you put it all together, if you take away the part of the axis that like was not interesting to a scientist, you get a chart that looks a little bit more like this. And then like we know more about what's going on in different types of phases. So here's Jonathan like annotating that chart, like putting together what's happening at different phases with actual little pictures of the whale, and you get something like this. But the reason I think this example is so smart is that Jonathan recognized that the context that you need to get this without thinking, to get it intuitively, was kind of the boring part, right? Like if you're a scientist who knows this, it's like, I don't need the part of the graph from 0 to 600 feet. That's just wasted space. If you're brand new to this idea, letting that space be empty helps you get it without thinking. And part of the goal, I think, of some successful data visualization is to get it intuitively, to get it without having to study, to just see it and be able to see immediately have this picture of what is going on. I think context, so here context is about putting back the thing that's boring. Like often we need to start earlier than we would when you've been studying something for your whole life, because people who are new to it, the boring part helps them. I think context can also be about taking away stuff. Here's an example where we took away almost everything. We said, will you please draw a chart for me? On the x-axis, I've told you, here's a parent, the income rank of your parents. And here's the percent of kids who go to college, don't graduate from college, but just enroll at some point. And we said, like, will you please draw that line for me? So how likely is it that rich kids go to college? How likely is it that poor kids go to college? And we said, I'll give you a point for the kids who grow up at the median income level. Their parents are the 50th percentile. Your dot should go through this. And so people might think something like, oh, well, I know that this line is going to slow up upwards, right? Like, I know it's true that like rich kids are more likely to go to college than poor kids. But, at some point, once your parents start making, $300,000 or something, maybe it flattens out. Maybe it doesn't matter so much just enrolling in college. We're not talking about what type of college. And then maybe at the very end, there's like a little bit of a trust fund dip, possibly, like something like that. We asked you to draw this line. And then, it tells you, here's what you drew and here's how it did, here's how other people do. The reason though, in this case, I think of context as taking away everything, getting rid of all the data altogether, is that reality to me, the actual truth of this, the actual true data doesn't look like data. It's not messy enough. And I think that message is really powerful and interesting. The idea that like truth, if you line up the dots, like, moving from the 1st percentile to the 10th percentile or the 90th percentile to 100th percentile changes your chances of enrolling in college almost exactly the same. Like that idea is mind blowing to me, like that idea about what's the role of class in America. But it's really hard to convey that because the line is too straight, right? Like the line is so straight, it doesn't look like data. And then, so we take data all away and make the context here be closer to like your expectations, right? Like if you just see the chart, it's so boring. It's like, it's a straight line. It feels obvious. But if you force yourself to ask, like, do you actually know? Then the context becomes the context between what I believed it was and what the truth is. And then our friends like do silly jokes like, it actually looks like the Seattle skyline, or pretty sure you just drew the snake eating the elephant from The Little Prince. So that's context. Scale is pretty easy. Context, I think you get the picture too. Like you can do it historically, you can do it compared to what people know, you can do it compared to the size of other things. And then the third type of thing, 3 of 3 that I think we're doing over and over and over and over again is just patterns. Here's one of my favorite sort of pattern examples. This is just a standard example of exit poll graphics. So after people vote, you ask them like, how did they vote? And you can break it down by different demographic groups or whatever. So in some ways I show this example too, because I think it's like just a nice, it's a nice clean table. It's smarter than a lot of tables, and that the shading lets me get the patterns without thinking about it too much. We'll talk more about the annotation layer in a few minutes, but like there's annotations, and that I think almost always you are going to spend more time with your data than the people looking at it. So you might as well just tell them what the interesting parts are. Like that doesn't hurt you at all. So there's a good annotation layer. I think this is a fine, nice example of just straightforward exit poll design. I think I would contrast this with data viz that I think is actually more fun, and contrast it with a different type of exit poll design. So here's an example from forever ago now. This is the Clinton-Obama primary. Each box is a state. And so, here's how women voted. They were more for Clinton. There's men more for Obama. Black people more for Obama. Whites were more supportive of Clinton. Young people, a little older, and a little older. But my favorite one is education. So there's no college, some college, college grads, and postgrads. And the box there, that's people in Arkansas with the postgraduate education. So I think of them as like they were friends of the Clintons. And that box, in some ways, to me, that idea of that box, that is the point of data visualization, is to be able to see things that you maybe didn't know. Like if you had to ask questions or to formulate hypotheses, to see the patterns that pop out, to see the outliers, that box like really speaks to me in a way that like, if you can see it in the table, if you design the table exactly to show it, you could probably figure it out. But you wouldn't go into it as a novice and be able to see like, oh, there's something different about that one. There's something interesting about that one. And I think that happens a lot in a lot of our choices of design of data visualization. Like some forms leave open the possibility for surprise in a better way. So an example, here's like a straightforward, here's a standard house election map. House districts are really hard, right? Like I can't see the house districts in New York City on this map, but Montana, which counts the same, takes up so many pixels. And you can see a certain type of pattern in this map, but it's a pattern that's always the same. It's, rural areas are more Republican and city areas are more Democrat leaning. And so that pattern is like not so interesting. I don't need to hold an election to have that pattern. There's a different form of this chart where like I think is more optimized for surprise to show up. And so here instead we said, let's give up on geography. Maybe geography isn't the most interesting thing, and say, instead, let me arrange these house districts by how we thought they were going to go before the start. So, here are the districts that Democrats were expected to win easily on the left. Here are the districts that Republicans were expected to win easily on the right. And if I scroll down this column, I can see now where are the surprises, right? Like this Oklahoma 5, that becomes an interesting race. That becomes a sort of race I want to know more about, because the way I've arranged this data, the possibility for surprise is like designed to come out, which is untrue, in the map, right? Like in the map, do I know that Oklahoma 5 is interesting? Like I don't. I could read it as like just, oh, that's another city. A different form of patterns. This is the same data. This is Raj Chetty's data, like we looked at about the chance that you go to college depending on your parents' income. Same sort of idea here. What is your income depending on what your as an adult, depending on what your parents' income was when you were a child. And it's a form that I like. I like the idea. I feel like I thought about this one for a lot, about like income is sticky, right? Like that you can see that the blue is like more likely than like, if it were pure random chance. The yellow is less likely than if it were pure random chance. And so you can see there's some kind of pattern going on here, but it's kind of hard, right? You have to think about it. You need a legend. You need to think about it more. We could do it instead. We could do it in 3D. We could try to show the actual shape more than just colors. When you're reducing it to colors, you're losing some information. You could try that. We could try it as line charts instead. We could try it as reducing the granularity of the data that we have and comparing across some different dimension. This one's not labeled, so it's a little hard, but again, it's not intuitive. And so as we talk about that, we talk about like, what is the mental metaphor that we're trying to show with this data? And it's really like kids climbing ladders. This is the image that you get if you just Google like kids climbing ladders. And we talked about like, should we approach this data like more like a video? Should we get like a bunch of kids in a gym? But that is something that like would have taken lawyers and would have been hard, and like, maybe we shouldn't have done it anyway because it would be too specific. And so we ended up thinking about that metaphor still and approaching this data like more something like this. So here the yellow dots are white boys and the blue dots are black boys, and they're all raised in rich households, right? So they're all raised in the top 25%, or yeah, top 20%, I guess. These are quintiles. So they're all raised in rich households, and here's what happens to them when they grow up as adults. And you can see the pattern in this. You can see the pattern of the blue dots, they're more likely to fall, that they end up as adults, they end up with an income that's like basically well spread out across the income distribution, about 20% in each quintile. The yellow dots, the wealth they grew up in, more likely to be preserved in their adulthood. The reason I like this example is that I feel like it captures some qualities about the data that are intuitive. One, the thing that's special about this data is that it's longitudinal. So unlike the earlier sketches that I showed you, like the sketch like preserves the idea that this data is longitudinal. Like intuitively, you get the idea that like, oh, we're going to follow people over time. And you could see that right away. And so that kind of pattern is also the thing that I think we're trying to do with data visualization. Skip that one. So scale, context, patterns. Those are I think the three strengths of data visualization, and times when you have you can use it to your power in ways that you could maybe not do if your only tool was words. Just to close, one last thought about, but I think words are crazy powerful too. And the mix of words and data visualization is crazy powerful. Like sometimes when groups of academics ask me for advice, my easiest advice for them is to like use a verb in the headline of your chart, right? Like even if you just say like, this is X is rising, or X is correlated with Y, or whatever it is, like instead of just saying like X and Y, like just tell me what it is. Use a verb in the headline of your chart. Words are super important. The other place we use words is to mix them exactly in with the data visualization. I think the annotation layer, also, like I said, with that exit poll graphic, also something that's like underused in academic work, or has the potential to make you stronger. So what do I mean by annotation layer? So, here's an example from Ukraine, the last type of conflict. It says like, what is a naval blockade, right? Like, and so I think I know, like, I think that concept is not super hard, but like, if I just say it, right? Like, there's 3 Russian ships trying to prevent the Ukrainian ships from leaving port. And so I just tell you what they are. Here's the Russian ones. I circle them. Here are the Ukrainian ones. And like, I get it right away in a way that like, I thought I got it with words, but I wasn't totally sure I got what was going on with words. It's a different example. This is an Olympics example, and I'll just let this play for a little bit because there's a lot of ideas about annotation in this.
I'm Henry Fountain, a science reporter for the New York Times. Ryan St. Onge, a freestyle aerial skier, and I are going to be breaking down his performance of what's called a double full, full, full. That's a triple backflip with 4 body twists. It's a jump he may attempt at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver.
As you approach the jump, you want to have your eyes up and you want to be as tall as possible.
Ryan wants to be going about 30 miles an hour at the end of the takeoff ramp, which will send him 55 feet in the air. At takeoff, gravity and the force of the ramp act on him to create torque that starts him rotating backward. By raising his arms, he increases his rotational inertia. He moves more of his weight away from the center of rotation, which is near the hips. Given the speed he's traveling at the end of the ramp, this increased inertia results in greater rotational momentum, or what you might call flipping power, as he leaves the ramp. In contact twisting, Ryan initiates a twist simply by pushing off with the legs at the end of the ramp. In a hula move, he creates a twisting motion by rotating the hips as if using a hula hoop. Often Ryan will start with a back arch, thrusting the hips forward, and then rotate the hips in one direction by moving to a side arch. The twisting occurs in the direction opposite to the hip rotation. Tilt twisting uses arm movements to cause the body to tilt to one side. Lowering the left arm, for example, causes a tilt to the right. Since Ryan is rotating backward around an axis that's roughly through his hips, the tilt transfers some of this rotational momentum to an axis that runs head to toe, causing him to spin or twist. The more tilt, the more twist.
And this is the part where you just hang on. You just go for the ride. You're twisting as fast as you can. You're trying to bring your arms in as tight to your body.
Ryan needs to complete 2 full twists in his first backward flip. So after starting the twist, he draws his arms closer to his body. This makes him more compact, decreasing his rotational inertia along the axis that runs from his head to his toes. Here, a principle called conservation of rotational momentum applies. He has less inertia, but momentum remains constant. The result? He spins faster.
As you can see at this point in the jump, I'm looking at the ground. I'm very straight, very tall, trying to make my body line as pretty as possible for the judges, but also at the same time, trying to measure how far I am away from the ground, how much flip rotation I have. And at this point, you can start to see my arms raise above my head, slow down my flip so that I elongate my body and have more time in the air before I hit the ground.
So there's all kinds of ideas, I think, about annotation going on in this one. And I never know quite when to stop it. But one of my favorite points, though, is like even the simple ones where it's like he raises his arms and we highlight arms, like, you know, like that might be a helpful use. You know, like you might not know what arms are. Of course, you know what arms are, but even the idea of highlighting it, the idea of saying like, here's what you should be looking at right now, I think it's still helpful. I think it still changes the way you experience this image, even when it's things that you already know. And that also is true. Like, again, you can say like, okay, that's fine. I don't study physical things. I can study ideas. I can study abstract, you know, spendings of money or whatever. That idea still holds here. Here's an example from David McCandless and Lee Byron. It's an old one also about like when Facebook was more of a thing, and it's they're looking at status updates for when people break up over the course of a year. Not complicated data, but I'm not doing justice to them in it, and that I'm taking off their annotation layer. So this data like could not, I guarantee whatever you study is probably more complicated than when do people break up on Facebook. And yet of the annotation layer, right, like that they helped you figure out what are the interesting parts, like here are some Mondays, here's April Fool's Day, so you know here's why this data might be like not good or you know flawed in some way, you know Christmas is too cruel. So even you know if you're an American, you're familiar with all of these holidays. These are not hard ideas at all. The data is not hard, the concept is not hard, but the annotation layer, it's still helpful. And again, it's the idea of like your data, you're going to spend more time looking at it than anyone else. So just tell me what the interesting parts of it are. An annotation layer can change a lot. I looked at the chart of the unemployment rate earlier. Here is one that was right before, I think this was the 2012 election. We said like, okay, so this was the last jobs report that mattered before that election. I said like, could we try a little harder than we normally tried? So normally you just get like charts like this. It's a bar chart, it's a line chart, it's fine. It's not trying too hard. In this particular example, we said like, let's do better. Let's give you a couple sets of goggles. And so say, if you want, you could put on your Democrat goggles and you could say, look, there's been 31 months of job growth in the private sector. And we can say, look, the unemployment rate fell more than expected last month. Also, if you wanted, you could put on your Republican goggles, same data, and you could say, look, the economy needs to add 150,000 jobs a month just to keep pace with population growth, and we're not meeting that bar. And the unemployment rate has been above 8% for 43 months. The reason I like this example is like all of those are true statements. You don't have to spin the data, you don't have to lie, you don't have to choose different data, you don't have to, you know, like do anything too complicated. But this idea of annotation layer changes how you experience it a lot. You put on your Democrat goggles and you could say, like, look, things are pretty good. Put on your Republican goggles and you say, look, things are not so good. And so if you do nothing, if you just say like it's pure data, you're also making a choice, but you're making a choice towards like people not interpreting it the way that you have after you've thought about it for a long time. Skip this one. Here, similar example, it can just also like highlight what the interesting parts are. This is the Chetty data that we've been looking at a couple of times now about like how do kids do depending on how they grew up. Here's just a bunch of line graphs of it. Like we already looked at college attendance and we looked at income. This is broken down, by gender or other things, and you have incarceration. What's the chance you were in prison on a single day in the bottom right corner for boys. That one. Same exact chart, but with just a tiny bit of annotation layer on it to say the Black boys who grow up in the top 1%, so really, really quite wealthy. They had the same chance of being incarcerated when they were in their early 30s as the white boys who grew up in families making $36,000 a year. So if I come at this without a lot of preconceptions, it encourages me to make those comparisons across the chart. It encourages me to say, what am I looking at in this chart, and what is the thing? What is the point? What is the data point? Like what is it saying? If I'm not familiar, the annotation layer can do a ton of work into making it more accessible. It also, I think, can help you like just in your choices of like answering better questions. Here's an example. This is a classic election map. It's not so different from the house map that we looked at earlier. This is an older example, but here, so I think this is an Obama-McCain map. So the red counties, more McCain, blue counties, more Obama. The standard map, boring, not boring, but just standard. At one point, when one of these elections, a researcher on the internet was like, that reminds me of work that I know about, where cotton was grown in the 1860s. Someone else can, layers them together and says, you're right, like those maps are like similar, they're not exactly perfect. You can see that this one doesn't exactly line up with the blue, but similar in some ways. Someone else comes along and says, where that shape comes from, right? Like this is the map of the sea millions of years ago. And so what happens is the sea recedes, the sea creatures die, they make the soil more fertile. It's conducive with cotton farming that's associated with slavery that changes the demographics 160 years later. And that's what you're seeing in that election map. And that, I think, often data visualization is good at the what, it can be good at the where, could be good at the when with some sort of time series, but the how and the why questions are better questions. And the annotation layer, or the idea of what are the visualizations that I'm lining up together to really explain something, I think that's where the true power is. So scale, context, patterns, that's what you're doing, the thread that comes across them. And I think your real superpower in helping people understand the work that you're doing is to take those things, take the strengths of data visualization and incorporate the power of words with them, either through your title or through annotation directly on the chart. So that's my prepared sort of intro. I think we have 20-ish minutes for questions, and I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Cox, for a wonderful presentation. I think I particularly enjoyed the part where you talked about your thought process in sort of pulling out the surprising parts of the data to for your readers. So yes, we do have 20 minutes or so for questions, and I'm going to start by posing one of the questions we had submitted beforehand as well. But otherwise, if anyone has questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll go around, you can ask them. So you showed a lot of fantastic visualizations, and I think one question quite a few people submitted was asking about the kinds of software and tools that you use to create these graphics. And for academics and other people sort of looking to do more visualization like this, what software and resources you would recommend?
Yeah, the software question, I can answer it in a couple of different ways. Like one, I really firmly believe that the tools are not so crazy important in this, or the tools are not what's blocking you from greatness in some ways, right? Like, so if you are a Stata person, if you are an Excel person, if you are an R person or Python or JavaScript, there is something in all of those things that will let you make great charts, right? Like, and so it doesn't matter, like, you know, there are people who've made great charts by drawing in the sidewalk with chalk. Great charts can be made with crayon. And so like part of me thinks that like the tools, like it can be like, you can think of them as like, oh, they are the difference between me and greatness. I don't think that tools, like there's lots of great tools. And so I do think it is helpful, it's very helpful to find something in which you are fluent with your data, right? Like, so you can think about like, I wonder what that looks like, and know what it looks like almost immediately, right? And so for me, like that thing where I am fluent is R, right? Like I can sketch graphics in R without having like much delay. Like I can just speak it and I can see it. For other people, that's different. A lot of the high-end graphics that you are seeing in like a media publication are done with some flavor of JavaScript. So whether that's D3 or Svelte is the new sort of framework or tool, or Svelte and D3 together. And so there's not, I think, a ton of people in the world who think so fluidly in JavaScript and data and research all to get like that Venn diagram starts to get pretty small. So like, I probably wouldn't recommend that like JavaScript should be your intro to data visualization unless that's where you're already fluent. But there are also people working on tools like Observable and others to make that easier for people and to make it closer to a fluid process. So lots of great tools. The high-end stuff is JavaScript. We use a bunch of like, you know, like our design work, some of it, and anything that's going to print is going through a product like Adobe Illustrator. Also not immodest users of simpler things like Excel for just looking at data and things like that. I think great data visualization can be made in a wide variety of tools.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions in the chat. One quick one about the Damien Hirst shapes, how that was. I mean, this comes back to the software thing, but specifically, I think that's a quick question to address, how the computer learned the shapes.
Sure. The true answer for that one is we had to do it in the afternoon, and so I traced them, right? Like I traced them in the grid, right? And so later, like, done things about like, just the image recognition has gotten so much better in the last 5 years, 10 years even, right? Like that, like to say like turn this thing into a vector, there's lots of software that can do that, right? Like trace this image, like Illustrator can do that. There's lots of machine learning sort of image processing libraries that can do that now. So the actual truth is that like we only had a few hours, so like it's just circles in a grid. Like the true production answer is that was done by hand, but there's the computer answers, more scalable, more interesting. If you're going to spend your life making graphics of Damien Hirst spot paintings, you would do it in a more scalable way.
Great. Okay, I think Alyssa has a question. So if you're there, you can.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really cool to see all these examples, really fascinating and thought-provoking. I wanted to know a little bit more about like the thinking behind the creative process. I appreciated you showing us a couple of different iterations of the Damien Hirst visualization, like, oh, this is how you can do it, but this is how you can improve on it. And I was wondering, like, what is the process for coming up with what is the best way to visualize a specific piece of the data? And like, how many iterations do you normally come up with? And is it a collaborative process where you're working with reporters and editors as well? Sorry, I know it's a lot of questions.
Yeah,
but...
Yeah, the answer I think is kind of like a mushy, it's disappointing, it depends sort of answer, right? But a lot of the high end stuff, like the sort of stuff that ends up in talks or whatever, is a collaborative thing, and usually it's a small team that usually someone is a stronger reporter or connected to the ideas or understands that. Usually someone's a stronger designer, someone's a stronger developer, and so those are kind of the three hats of combinations of things. Often it's like, I do think I spoke earlier about like the fluidity, about like trying on different visualizations, but often it stems from the question and what's available. Like I think like some of the house example is a good one, that like the default is to stick it on a map, and that's where tradition comes from, and that seems like the obvious answer, but the limitations of that are so clear immediately. Like, I don't know what the house district shape is. They're not familiar to me. There's no possibility for surprise. And so I think some of the good sketching comes from asking better questions about like, what would look in, or where would the surprise come from, or where would this data reveal the type of pattern that I am trying to think about. And so that's a bunch of the examples that I spoke about today, some of them are probably, most of those are like couple week long projects, but some of them aren't, right? Some of them, the Hearst thing was done in a day and a half because we had to do it in a day and a half. The unemployment goggles one was done in a day and a half, not because we had to, but because that's, that's when we turned to doing it, right? Like, and so those, the time scale, like, and the amount of sketching you do, I think it scales to the available space, right? So like projects stretch on or not.
Okay. So I don't see any more hands up, but we do have questions in the chat. So one thing that's come up is the question of like visualizing qualitative data, what your kind of process for that is. I mean, I think the Damien Hirst example is in some way, like there's a lot of quality. Well, you presented the paintings in a qualitative way, but the underlying data was the prices. So, but if you have more pure qualitative data, how you go about that? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not thinking of a ton of great examples of that off the top of my head. I think sometimes like the juxtaposition of things or the annotation can still be powerful in those cases. I can't, there are examples, someone that's just surfacing just last week, a couple, like, good examples of text visualization, which I could think of as more qualitative. I think really like my cheap answer to that would be like probably the way that at least my old career at the Times, the way we could be most productive with qualitative information was not data visualization, right? Like it didn't speak to those core strengths of scale, context patterns. Like, and instead the strength of qualitative was either in ideas or in photographs or in, quotes or woven stories, like the tell of stories. So I'm certain there are great, like I know that there are great qualitative examples. I don't think I have a ton of them in my own career, and that I think probably the greatest qualitative stuff is like the lead anecdote that just makes your jaw drop and like blows you away, and like less so in data visualization space. Okay, trying to get. So one thing I wanted to ask, and that's come up in the pre-submitted questions as well, is how data visualization has sort of changed over the course of your career, moving from maybe more static visualizations to things like dashboards, and then particularly now with the prevalence of smartphones and handheld devices, has that influenced your work and where the field is going?
Yeah, when I started, we basically only made things for print. There's a folder that you like drop things into, and maybe someone would pick it up for the website, or try to adopt it, but like they didn't even sit in the same building, and they weren't really, they weren't really on the same team even. And so it was a print only thing. And when then was an early era on the web. The potential of it was interesting, and I think we were probably, the mistakes that were made in that era were things that were like probably too dashboardy, or too like, all of a sudden I have the ability to make a button, so like I will make a button, and like, too much, like all of my deepest regrets from that era were you know too much like amateur interface design for interfaces that like no reader actually actually wanted to use, probably. But that was still also a fun period, because it was like, the rules weren't clear, right? Like, you just figure things out and see what you could do, and like a lot of boundaries were being broken, even if they weren't hard boundaries, just because the medium felt like it was as a new medium to play in. And then you're right that the smartphone like has changed things a lot, or in the sense that like, like the majority of Times traffic now, I don't think this is a secret, is mobile, is a mobile device. And so if you're making for that, right, you just don't have a lot of room. um the classic sort of uh graphic, like the ones that we're looking at the on the of art on the wall behind me, right? Like, you have this big central image, and then you have parts of it that are smaller that help explain it, that help pack it out. But like, there's this sense of hierarchy that is like in the good graphics immediately clear about like, here, this is the important thing. And I think when I talk to academics, I think about that too, about like I think academic poster design, like just the traditions of it, are so broken in that they lack the sense of hierarchy. That like, not, you don't get this clear sense right away, other than like, our traditions of reading left to right and top to bottom, about like, this is the most important big idea, and here are some supporting ideas. Like, it's all just very flat. And so I think the phone has sort of like moved us back towards the like, hierarchy is hard there too, because like, essentially you can just, you don't have a ton of room. You have a tiny amount of room on some phones to do a lot of things, and you can just scroll downward. And so it has, I think, led to more work. It's in good ways. It has stopped some of the most complicated interactive work about like, here are 12 buttons you could click and you figure out what the interesting thing is. In bad ways, I think it has lost some sense of the beauty of hierarchy, about like, here's the big idea and here's some supporting ones, and here's how they flow together on the phone.
Great, thank you. So I'm still waiting to see if I don't think we have any other questions now. So I'm going to go back to another submitted one. So this, I mean, a lot of the examples you showed looking at things like the effects of education and effects of race and incarceration levels, you were looking at different communities. And I think the other side from a data viz perspective is when you're presenting data to sort of who your audiences are in terms of different communities. So does that affect how you design your visuals, or for different education levels or even literacy levels?
Yeah, I mean, my career at the Times, right, we were basically designing for, relatively smart middle schoolers, maybe, is like who, and I think you do see it, like, I think the whale example is an example of that, where if you're designing for your fellow scientists, like the 0 to 600 feet, boring, like cut it, like, break your axes, not the interesting, not the actual frontier of knowledge, not the new part. When you're designing for people who don't really know the space, not boring, put it back, use the space, right? Like, you have all kinds of space. Vertical space on a phone is super cheap. And so that, I think that design for audiences has is some of the choices we were making, but I was always like, trying to make things for a relatively general audience. And I totally buy into the idea that, especially in different academic communities, like your principles should be different. And I'm on board with that. And like, it can be more complicated, and you can assume that people start at 80,000 feet instead of, 22,000 feet. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask a question about, well, one of the questions was about color, choice of color, but I think I'm going to make it a little more general and say, when you have a particular type of data that you want to show, you could have multiple options for how you present it, but also all these technical things like color and font and just spacing. How do you sort of decide without being overwhelmed by the options?
Yeah, I can sometimes think like you're like, I don't know, like the mental picture I have is like, you have your DJ board in front of you and you have so many knobs, and like you can't change all the knobs at once, right? Like there's no, so I think general advice is to like, show more restraint than you want to, especially as a beginner. Like I think you will be more powerful if you say like, I have 2 colors to play with, as opposed to like, I have 8 colors, and that forces you in part to decide like, what is the important thing? Where's where I want to spend the 1 color I have. There's a tool called Data Wrapper, which is a very good, like, I think cutting edge sort of intro tool for like standard basic charts. There's a woman there named Lisa, and she just got married, so she changed her last name, but she posts blog posts for Data Wrapper. You could find it on the Data Wrapper blog. And last week she wrote like, here are 10, I think, examples about like color. And I think the thread through all of them was like, show more restraint than you want. And so that is kind of my general advice. But like, I think you're thinking to yourself, you want to show you're trying to show a message if you're designing for people, unless you're building interfaces for yourself, in which case like let me see if this works. I'll find an example. I'll skip that. So like, you're trying to show a message. So color, things like annotation, things like the words you put on the top of your graphic are your tools for that. And so to use all the tools you have and to show more restraint than you want in your heart, because you've spent so much time with this data. Even if you are talking to expert audiences, you've spent more time than other people. And so like, give them a fighting beginner's chance would be kind of my design advice. And that like, good design is about hierarchy, right? Like if you think of yourself as like, I'm not a designer, right? Like that's fine. There's a lot of design principles that I think you can recast as math, right? Like, so you can recast things like you can say the thing I am optimizing is minimize eye movement. And so if I want to minimize eye movement, I'm going to put the labels on my lines directly on my lines. So you think I don't have to go back, here's the legend, here's the graph, here's the legend, here's the graph. And so you can pick that good design principle up from just, if you want to recast that as a math optimization problem, you can recast it just as a math optimization problem about your design. The designer in your heart can be, I'm going to minimize eye movement, and that can make, choices can fall out of that principle too.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we're almost right at the end of our time now. So unless anyone has any more questions, I'll thank Ms. Cox for a wonderful presentation. I hope you've all taken away some useful tips for your future visualizations. And Ms. Cox, you shared your email address earlier, so I'm sure if people have additional questions, they can reach out to you. And thank you all for attending and sharing questions. And we'll be hosting another workshop on policy briefs in the next couple of weeks or so. So look out for an email on that, and that will be to help you combine what you've learned from our previous workshops on writing strategies and writing for policy, and this data visualization workshop, particularly for anyone interested in submitting a brief to the National Science Policy Network competition. So thank you again, Ms. Cox, and thank you all for attending.
Great, thanks for having me, and thanks for spending part of your lunchtime with me too. It's good to see you today.